The Acolyte is making a huge mistake, one which has repercussions that aren't currently being talked about. Greetings Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. The witches of Brendok were revealed to have found the secret to creating life within the Force. Mother Anastasia and Mother Coriel openly talked about performing a ritual with their ways of the Force, or as they refer to it as the thread, in order to create the twins, May and Osha.
We were blessed with a miracle, the gift of life.
This is clearly echoing how Plagueis and Sidious were inadvertently responsible for the creation of Anakin in Legends continuity. However, the science of creating life in the Force is not entirely the accomplishment people believe it is, nor is it as easy as the witches make it out to be. In fact, it is literally an affront on the living Force, so much that after Plagueis perfected the art of manipulating the midi-chlorians, the Force literally began to resist and avoid him. In today's holocron, we are going to be going into the research notes of the revolutionary Plagueis to break down the full process of creating life through the midi-chlorians and how Plagueis' breakthrough was actually a detriment to the Force. But not only that, how the witches of Brendok have made a grave mistake in their pursuit of life, one which the Force is not easily going to forgive. So now, let us begin. Plagueis' journey of creating life was not a quick nor an easy one. Unlike most things in the dark side, this one did not come because of his special traits of anger or hatred. The study of Sith alchemy and science required a life's dedication. Plagueis himself was luckily a long-lived species himself, with the capability of living far beyond 100, but even he was well within his elder years before he reached the point of being able to influence the midi-chlorians. At first, Plagueis attempted to stop people from dying, using a crew as guinea pigs on a ship that he murdered. At that time, he was only able to repair muscle and organ tissue, enough to bring the subjects back to consciousness for a few agonizing moments before they immediately died again. It took a long time of repeated trial and error before Plagueis found a way to actually coerce the midi-chlorians themselves into doing his will. Plagueis, though, was not satisfied with merely bringing a dead body back to life, as Sith had been performing necromancy spells for millennia, but Plagueis' pursuits were far more refined. In the words of Plagueis himself, "My ultimate goal is the secret of life. That life gives us consciousness, for without consciousness, each of us are nothing. Through science, I will create new life and sustain my own. There is no reason why Darth Plagueis could not live forever." Plagueis' writings explain what the midi-chlorians are, a conduit of Force energy in all living things, and the energy that gives life. They are directly tied to the life force of their hosts, forming what's called endosymbiosis, meaning that when the host dies, so do the midi-chlorians, and on the flip side, the host will die if purged of their midi-chlorians. This is what stunted Plagueis' research for the longest time, not being able to act quickly enough to save someone from death before all of their midi-chlorians deteriorated first. He experimented many times with attempting to cause the midi-chlorians to replicate, theoretically causing them to create life. In order to do this though, Plagueis would have to impose his will on the midi-chlorians through a very specific avenue. The Sith Lord mentions how all of them are connected to one shared consciousness through a fundamental force, a force that Plagueis calls the pneuma. According to Plagueis, the Force exists and interacts with the universe through three fundamental forces. The Apeiron, which is the realm of things like space, time, gravity, and the cosmos. The Anima, which gives life but not conscious thought to animals, plants, and beings. And the Pneuma, which is the expression of conscious thought. The Force interacts with all things like building blocks and in a unique way with the living Force, specifically having to do with the Anima and the Pneuma, which is where the midi-chlorians reside. But in the Pneuma, that is where we have to pay attention. Thinking, self-aware minds contribute to the collective, which is accessed by many naturally telepathic species, as well as by various mind tricks of the Jedi and Sith. All affect mind-based powers interact directly with the Pneuma. This is where the midi-chlorians' unifying consciousness resides. It is the midi-chlorians themselves. We gave all of that explanation so that we can share exactly how Plagueis describes the art of influencing the midi-chlorians. This is what he writes. The solution, therefore, is not to introduce new midi-chlorians, but to impose one's will on the midi-chlorians already present within the subject. This can be done through the energy of the pneuma, just as a warrior in peak condition can lift a heavy weight. so can someone with a sharpened mental focus and an affinity of the Force achieve a measurable effect on living cells. Plagueis began his experiments on small rodents, using his will amplified through his body's own midi-chlorians to override their lesser concentrated counts and voices, though it proved more challenging than he had predicted. Because midi-chlorians are linked by a universal mind, the midi-chlorians in Plagueis' own cells seem to resist the imposition upon their fellows. Luke Skywalker adds his own annotation within Plagueis' notes, where he says that the one factor that Plagueis could not measure was the will of the Force. This explains the resistance to Plagueis' perversion of life. But Luke also adds that he didn't believe the Force ever felt compelled to speak to Plagueis, and that the Force actually hated him for obvious reasons. Plagueis would eventually succeed in his quest though, first with animals and then with people. He forced the midi-chlorians to override their natural life cycles, and what he discovered was that they would draw upon the Force in order to sustain themselves, thus halting tissue decay on a microscopic level, putting an end to aging and all disease. Once Plagueis could halt aging, he discovered he could go much further. He surmised that in theory, they could be induced to create life on a molecular level, perhaps even causing the cells of a mother to be persuaded to create a zygote. And here's where we finally reach the meat and potatoes. All of Plagueis' research up until this point was simply to gain a mastery of the midi-chlorians so as to perpetuate his own life and to stop others from dying or bring them back. If this wasn't bad enough though, the mad scientist was ready to actually create a new life inside of a mother, forcing her cells to cooperate into creating life. As an aside, assuming the witches of Brendok came anywhere close to this level of research, it would be surprising to say the very least. Plagueis had access to a self-made state-of-the-art laboratory, centuries of Sith knowledge, and the money to access all of the test subjects he could ever desire. The Brendok witches live on a frontier forest world, among people we assume they care too much about to experiment on, in a castle made of flammable stone. Inconsistencies aside, we'll revisit the witches in a moment in order to explain not only does it not make sense for them to have done this, but why it was a massive mistake. But as for Plagueis, we're just getting started. Plagueis would obtain hundreds of identical humanoids, each with a consistent midi-chlorian count. After experiments, he succeeded in prodding the midi-chlorians to replicate themselves through asexual fission, though in most cases this process increased the numbers uncontrollably and would kill the host. For a short amount of time, Plagueis gave up on this experiment, but he would write this. But I believe that by using this method, I can trick midi-chlorians into creating a zygote. Then it would simply be a matter of growing the subject under normal biological conditions. Such a subject could, of course, take years to hit the developmental milestones of a typical humanoid, but he could have a midi-chlorian count as high as 20,000 per cell. This is more than any Jedi or Sith in recorded history. Although entirely theoretical, such an achievement is intriguing to me. Right now, it is unknown whether or not Luke is aware that Anakin was a product of the Force rejecting a dark side ritual, but he did have a reaction to this information written by Plagueis. At the bottom of the page, Luke would write this: "I cannot help feeling a chill as I read this account by Plagueis, knowing that my father was known for his high midi-chlorian count, which was supposedly even higher than that of Yoda's." Darth Plagueis would eventually return to this experiment, just as he did the first. He started with animals and smaller creatures. For an extremely long period of time, Plagueis became reclusive within his laboratory, endlessly experimenting. Eventually, he would take Palpatine through his lab a single time, where there were rows upon rows of creatures within tubes. Sidious would be dumbfounded when he saw that his master had revealed each of them were created using only the Force. But Plagueis would issue a warning. Plagueis says this: "I failed to exercise due caution as we attempt to wrest the powers of life and death from the Force. As we seek to tip the balance, the Force resists our efforts, action and reaction. Something akin to the laws of thermodynamics." Yet despite knowing this, Sidious and Plagueis moved forward with the ritual that would change galactic history. The two had succeeded in willing the Force to shift and tip irrevocably towards the dark side. Not a mere paradigm shift, but a tangible alteration that could be felt by anyone in the Force. The shift had been the outcome of months of meditation, during which Plagueis and Sidious had sought to challenge the Force, to gain sovereignty, and to poison the galaxy with the dark side. Coming together as a single entity, Plagueis and Sidious brought the power of their will to bear and asserted sovereignty over the Force, something that had never been done before. Suddenly, in a moment, the Force yielded to them, and they believed that they had won. The balance of the light and dark side had suddenly tipped to cast a veil over the light of the Jedi and plunging the Force into darkness. The novel then tells us that Plagueis, now drunk on this new power, had attempted to then bring it into a creation of life, not just some animal, but a Force-sensitive person. He would then literally stretch out with his will to inform every being of his existence on a psychological level and impact them all, whether of his own species, insectoid, human, free, or slave. At first, Plagueis felt nothing, and believed that he had ultimately failed, though he wasn't bothered by this, since he had conquered death and was currently reversing his own aging process. But a terrible series of events then occurred. The Force grew completely silent, as if in flight from him, and all of the created beings in the lab instantly succumbed to horrifying diseases and passed. The Force was done with Plagueis, just as he had predicted, and it resisted him and used his powers to bring into life a being that would bring balance to the Force and destroy the Sith. The Force reached across the galaxy to a humble slave woman on Tatooine, completed what Plagueis had tried to do for the dark side, but instead, for the light, the chosen one of the Jedi, Anakin Skywalker, was conceived. And now at long last we reached the problem. All of this work, time, effort, and clear abrasion to the living Force, Plagueis had done this in order to achieve mastery over life and death, and thus caused the Force to reject him in such a dramatic way that it literally created the Chosen One prophecy. The two Sith, less than a decade before the Battle of Naboo, had shifted the balance and provoked the Force to lash out. This was no mere dark side experiment, but an unheard perversion of life itself. Concerning what the witches of Brendok did is no small feat. All of Plagueis' methods that we just went through explaining is a strenuous process, having the Force on a microscopic level, using it to the point where no other forceful being has ever attempted. It's not something that can just be mentioned in a throwaway line. This action is a terrible thing in the realm of the Force. The witches believe they can just pluck the strands of the thread as they please with no regard to cause and effect, and in doing so, have created two unnatural lives. They don't seem to understand the fundamentals of the Force, which is that it is a living energy. Creating life like this completely impacts the greater balance of the cosmos, not just one person's ovaries. I believe the real problem with this choice in the Acolyte is that not only does it undermine Anakin's origins, but it also cheapens the accomplishment of Plagueis. He was the first and the only person to do this, and it required years upon years of trial and error, with more repeated failures than successes to accomplish his goal. And even then, he didn't succeed in creating Anakin on purpose. His success was attributed to the Force rejecting his trial, rejecting all of his work. Creating life through the Force should never be an easy thing to do. It's already problematic to twist existing life to the ways of the Sith alchemists and Night Sisters. What would have been better at least is if they had written Plagueis to actually be involved in this process. But at the end of the day, what the witches had done and what Plagueis did in Legends continuity is not a good or a virtuous thing. It is an affront on the Force, made by an evil villain, a Dark Lord of the Sith. But anyway, my friends, this is why we believe the Acolyte made a grossly negligent mistake in regard to the creation of life through the Force. Now that we've explained the full process of Plagueis, how do you feel about what the witches of Brendok did? And do you believe that there is any plausible way that they could have accomplished this with their own magic? And as another question, would you have wanted to see this process happen on screen if Plagueis ever made an appearance? Let us know your thoughts on this and the Acolyte down below. And as always, my friends, thank you so much for visiting the archives today, and may the Force be with you.